Tonight, for the first time, 8 Republicans vying for the White House debating each other on the stage in Milwaukee.
That's right, that debate just ending moments ago, and these are the 8 candidates who are on that stage tonight. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, businessman Vivek Ramaswamy, former Governor Nikki Haley, Senator Tim Scott, former Vice President Mike Pence, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. Those were the 8. They're on that stage.
And tonight in the upstate, local watch parties bringing people together. One of those happening in Greer. This one for several state Republican Party officials. And we got to speak with the chairman for the 4th Congressional District earlier tonight. He told us many Republicans in the state are proud of the choices the party has for a possible nominee.
That's right, Fox County's Zach Prelutsky was at another watch party tonight, this one in Greenville for younger Republicans. Zach.
Well, Justin, just took a quick straw poll of the people watching the debate on who they think really impressed tonight. And really, there was an array of names from Vivek Ramaswamy, Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, some of the more popular names of the people who think did well during the debate. And really, that debate just wrapping up now. But for 2 hours, those 8 Republican candidates taking the stage together for the first time. Among some of the more heated moments during the debate was during topics such as Ukraine, the southern border, fossil fuels, and obviously the U.S. economy. Now, the economy is a big issue. A lot of the people here at Young Greenville that I talked to say they're going to be paying attention to as we head into the primary in February and then the general election next November. And I spoke with the Political Engagement Committee chair, who says that he sort of has his mind made up as we're nearing the primary, but came into this debate really wanting to know how the candidates would interact with each other and interact about the former President Donald Trump, who is not a part of this debate. And I asked him who he thinks did well for their candidacy tonight.
I think Vivek's been the most with the most firepower. Between him and Christie, they've both been explosive. Nikki Haley's had some good shining moments there. Ron DeSantis keeps interjecting, which I think that's how he's controlling the narrative. They're trying to avoid him in a sense, and he's just like, you're going to have to hear me out.
And a lot of these Republicans on stage tonight have already visited South Carolina, even here in the upstate. But it's a different dynamic seeing them all up on stage together. And if you're keeping track at home, tomorrow is exactly 6 months until the South Carolina Republican primary, February 24th. So obviously some time to go, but it's going to be here before you know it. And these Young Greenville Republican Club members getting ready the best way they can by watching the first Republican debate here tonight. For now, reporting live in Greenville, Zach Prelutsky, Fox Carolina News.
All right, Zach, certainly a lot to talk about. And before the debate, we heard from the chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party. She said this debate will only promote the MAGA agenda.
Republican candidates have decided to embrace the anti-freedom MAGA agenda pioneered by Donald Trump and uplift policies that hurt hardworking families in South Carolina and across the country. They've chosen to rip away the freedom to make our own healthcare choices. They've chosen to stand with the NRA over schools and communities, and they've chosen to embrace ugly culture wars, and they've chosen the wealthy and corporations over hardworking families. President Biden and Vice President Harris will be running to fight for our freedoms and grow the economy from the middle out and the bottom up, not the top down.
And one candidate who is clearly not at the GOP debate tonight, frontrunner and former President Donald Trump. He decided to not attend because he says the public already knows who he is. Instead, he did an interview with former Fox host Tucker Carlson. And in response to that interview, a spokesperson for the Biden campaign released a statement saying in part, quote, in his softball interview posting tonight, Donald Trump will again make clear that he's running on the same extreme and deeply unpopular MAGA agenda the American people have rejected time and time again.